Welcome to Win the Future, a podcast where we chat with folks who are tackling the most significant challenges our communities face today to make for a better tomorrow. I'm your host, Brett Broster. This is episode number 13. Hello and welcome everybody to another episode of Win the Future. This is episode 13, and I'm here today with a very special guest, a friend and somebody who's been kind of a mentor to me, Achim Bergmann, who is the partner at Bergmann Zwerdling. And Achim, welcome.
Thank you for having me, Brett. Appreciate it.
Thanks for being on. So Achim, let's start with talking a little bit about obviously a crazy cycle, campaign cycle amid a pandemic. Can you talk a little bit about, as a direct mail consultant, national level, what you've seen how was it? How was it dealing with campaigns even?
Well, it was completely different than I've been at this now for almost 30 years in working campaigns, and it was completely different than anything I've ever experienced or anything anybody's faced. We had to make a lot of adjustments inside our business, and all of the campaigns did have to make a lot of adjustments, just like Americans, people across the world had to make adjustments to their daily lives. And from the campaign perspective, there were things that were pieces of the campaign that just had to change fundamentally. In addition to that, there were changes in laws to expand absentee voting, for example, mail balloting. Obviously, they got a lot of attention around the presidential campaign, but that changes the entire campaign strategy. When you have people who are voting ahead of election day, there were a lot of states that this was the first time that they did that, including Connecticut, on a large basis, and that fundamentally changes how and when you communicate with voters and the tools at our disposal to try to mobilize people to vote. And so there were some additional tools that were provided to campaigns through, vote by mail, and there were a lot that were taken away because in several states there was a reticence to do door knocking, field campaigns, person-to-person politics, which is really the core of a lot of political experience for people. That's something that changed dramatically.
So with that, and with the inability to knock on doors, how does that change a mail plan? I would imagine the mail plan becomes more robust, but then you're also dealing with different deadlines, a USPS issue, several different factors that were difficult.
Right, and the Postal Service issue was something that, and we were very sensitive to that, obviously, because that's how we communicate with voters. And so we took a number of steps to try to expand our tracking capabilities to track how fast pieces move through the mail stream and whatnot. And we did find, what we found was there was no change in depending on where we actually delivered the mail. But if we were to, deliver the mail to a post office in a statewide campaign, we did work in Pennsylvania. And there was a real difference. If we mailed it from Philadelphia, it took a long time to get to Pittsburgh, actually, much longer than ordinarily would. So we had to make a lot of adjustments there. But mail and digital communication became, and television as well, like all those forms of communication that dealt with people, being in their homes. Became more critical and more important, and to compensate for the lack of any personal outreach. There weren't rallies. There were drive-in, car rallies that campaigns did. There weren't any, in-person rallies like that. There were a lot of states where people, as I mentioned, didn't go out and knock on doors, and so to compensate for that, we had to expand how we were communicating in the mailbox and communicating digitally. And there was one, Nielsen did a study, I think it was in the summer, that reported that people's home screen usage, television and internet was up 60% because people were at home. They weren't, people were out of jobs. I mean, it's terrible, but you had more of a captive audience for all of these forms of communication, and it did impact the when, in these states that were mail, voting by mail for the first time, or even in some states that had voted by mail for years, there was a greater percentage. I mean, California is an example that, everybody was mailed a ballot this year, which had never been done before in California. In the past, it's been about 70 to 75% of the vote has been through the mail. So it's almost everybody, but it's not everybody. And that changed, our schedule, but it also changed who voted, and had a huge impact on the outcomes of these elections.
Wow. So, and when you talk about Pennsylvania, so with those big 6 states in a presidential year, how was the mail schedule different in those states versus others where you may not have as much activity from the top of the ticket?
In terms of the mail, like it didn't. I wouldn't say that there was a tremendous difference. It was a question of the width of how broad that people needed to be to communicate, because there were in states like those that had a lot of activity happening from up and down the ballot. You also had these media markets were just super crowded, and people were beginning to tune out the television. People were getting pummeled with digital advertising, and so for our medium in direct mail, what we needed to do is to make sure that we're talking to enough people to be persuasive. We have an objective to persuade people. For example, we needed to make sure that we were getting to a level of the vote that was going to predict the outcome in terms of turnout, and which was much higher this year than it ever has been before. And there, you can read any number of reports on that, but we needed to make sure that we were getting breadth in terms of our target. And ordinarily mail in a campaign that is a big campaign like that has a lot of television advertising, we're a supplemental communicator, and we're picking out a target, and we're trying to move that target, and that target tends to be relatively narrow for budgeting purposes. But in this cycle, where we could, we expanded that because people were in states like that where there was a lot of communication. We did work in North Carolina, for example, where there was just the Senate race or the governor's race, there was a presidential race happening, and so we needed to make sure that our target was wide enough, broad enough, to deliver a message effectively, because people were tuning out the ads because there were just too many of them.
Did you find that with an expansion of the absentee ballot program in some states like Connecticut, others were able to do different things based on the state laws, did you find that you had to move up the schedule for particular demographics versus others? Therefore, kind of bulk mail maybe took a bit of a backseat relative to other states?
The way it ended up happening, in part because of President Trump's railing against mail ballots, the states that, like Connecticut, that were really first-time adopters of a no fault, like no reason, no excuse, vote by mail, where anybody could apply and vote absentee this year. And this bore out in Connecticut, as it did in Pennsylvania and Michigan, for example. And you saw these election results. Everybody sat up and watched, CNN or MSNBC or Fox or whatever, watching through the night and through the last, through the 3 or 4 days after the election, to see these returns come in, and these mail ballots being heavily Democratic. And the same thing happened in Connecticut, where it was the Democrats who were willing to go out and wanted to be safe and stay away from crowds on election day, and were putting their trust in government to count their votes, which all the votes got counted, but that voted by mail. And Republicans who didn't. And so the partisan differential in terms of who applied for an absentee ballot was extreme. And so it did have an impact on our thinking. First of all, on how do we recruit more Democrats who may be unlikely to vote by mail, because that option exists now in a state like that didn't before. And then two, like, who is it that is voting by mail that we weren't expecting to vote. So we're making sure that we're communicating with them, and then three, making sure that we're solidifying, we're getting our message out, and establishing what the contrast is, or what the brand is for our candidate in those races much earlier, because the ballots are being mailed out. I mean, in North Carolina, ballots were mailed out in early September. So that was, people had ballots in hand in the first week of September in North Carolina. Pennsylvania was different. All these states have different schedules, but you had to take that into account to say, okay, that's, we do a lot of work in the West and in other states that are traditionally vote by mail. Some that are Colorado that has been all mail now for cycles, and Oregon has been all mail for 20 years. But those places, you need to treat the day that ballots are mailed like it's election day. And then you have this 4-week long or 3-week long or whatever it is voting window. And so you need to establish your message by the time people get their ballots. The percentage share in places like Connecticut wasn't as high. It wasn't 60, 70% of the vote was coming in by mail, but it was much more than it used to be. And so we had to make sure that we did that. And then we have this voting window period where we know these people have a ballot, and we're communicating with them, but we also know these other people, we expect them to vote at the polls, and we need to communicate with them.
Interesting. So you've got, on one hand, a difficult change up in the way when and where people are voting. On another, you kind of have the campaign, right? And I know you spend a ton of time in a normal year, especially an on year, traveling and meeting with campaigns, getting to see up close the candidate and how the campaigns are working together. But obviously that process becomes really fractured when, one, you can't travel, but two, these campaigns aren't working in the same place for the most part. Talk a little bit about those dynamics, what you saw this year?
Yeah, I mean, COVID really changed the energy and the connections around these campaigns, which I mean, this is not unlike life at large, but the sort of kind of Hollywood image of a campaign, of like a bunch of phones ringing and people in one place buzzing about and everything like that, which happens in real life in a lot of places where there's just a lot of activity going on. Volunteers are coming in and out. People are being dispatched. There's a lot of energy and connection about that. That's just human, fueled by human interaction. That wasn't happening in the campaigns and campaigns that were organizing in one place. Let's say a campaign of 5 staff that were in the same place. They're all masked. They're being, they're taking precautions and being safe. But what happened with us as practitioners? Yeah, you're right. Ordinarily, I'd be out on the road. I'd be going to visit these campaigns. I'd be working with the candidates in person, doing debate prep or something like that. And all of that was handled just like you and I are talking now, over a computer. And there were some candidates I worked with and spent a lot of time, on the phone or on Zoom with, that I've never met in person. I mean, literally, got brought into the campaign post COVID. And so these were people that I'd never met in, face to face in person, just all virtually over a screen. So I think, there's a family benefit to it. Sure. Like, I'm here and I'm with my wife and my kids, which is great. I love that. I'm working in the house, I haven't been in my office in months. And so I'm in this little makeshift space here. It's like shared with, some workout stuff and things. But the downside was that I couldn't really feel, what was happening on these races. I couldn't be there. I couldn't be in, there's just a lot that happens in those personal interactions that it's hard to make up for over the phone or over Zoom.
Now you're looking at 2021 and looking to go into another election cycle where you're likely to have some of the same restrictions that you had this November. What are you telling or advising campaigns or candidates as they look to go into an election cycle with one under your belt and building their strategy? What kind of tactics change, timelines, etc.?
Sure. The digital organizing aspect became a much bigger deal. Having staff, having people who are dedicated to social media management and organizing, almost like a field staff, but they don't, they interact with people only online, and that aspect is critical, and that's an early, depending on the size and scope of a campaign, that should be an early hire, an early focus to build from the bottom up. But the one thing that is and this is always going to be delicate based on the state and the restrictions in the state, and it's difficult to do depending on how the perception is of Democrats. Like, I work for Democrats, and so in California, for example, our campaigns did not do any canvassing, any door-to-door canvassing, because the thought was the negative reaction to Democrats doing that being seen as hypocritical. When Democrats are in control of most of the levers of government in the state and move fast to try to limit the spread of COVID with stay-at-home restrictions, and now they're back in it. Actually, LA County and others have regional restrictions and stay-at-home rules. But you saw Governor Newsom get really criticized widely in the media for in attending a small dinner, because of the allegation of hypocrisy. So there was a lot of sensitivity about that. In Connecticut, Democratic campaigns developed protocols, safe protocols, and I would say, first of all, Republicans in every state we worked in went out and knocked on doors and canvassed, and they had their own way of doing it. They had, and I don't. It's hard to say. I think some of these people were calling masks a political thing, but still, like, they had protocols, and in Connecticut, the Democratic campaigns developed their own protocols, and they would go out and they'd knock. They'd step back, 6 to 10 feet or so. Everyone would be masked, and they would still be able to engage with people at the door, and in Connecticut, Democrats beat incumbent Republicans. In California, that didn't happen in most places. The only places that did happen were places that where Democrats wildly outspent Republicans, and Republicans picked up 4 congressional seats in California. Those congressional campaigns, those Democrats didn't knock on any doors. So that's something that I think we need to face. Now we're certainly hoping that that these vaccines are effective or distributed well and everything, and we get to a point in time this election cycle that we're not in the same position for the even year for 2022 for most of the campaigns. But a lot of people we have people who have elections coming up in March in some states, and they're operating under this same kind of tight restrictions, and that's something I think campaigns need to face and have a real conversation about, because in terms of the effectiveness, still, while it's as a campaign tactic, it's the least efficient way of communicating, because you still have to get somebody at the door. You have to have a human being go out there and knock on the door. It's the most effective in terms of its persuasive impact. Having a face-to-face conversation is still more effective, and you want to have that. And I think that was something that was missing. I'm not saying that would have made up a difference of 5 percentage points or whatever a race may have lost by, but we had campaigns who won or lost by less than 100 votes in some places. That absolutely makes a difference in a close race, whether or not you're talking to people face to face.
Interesting. So, even in Connecticut, where we're based out of, I went and knocked on doors with our good friend James Maroney a few times, and I anticipated folks being very hesitant to have a conversation or to even answer the door. And people were very safe when they did answer the door, but the contact rate was much higher than I would have thought, and people wanted to have that at a safe distance, mask wearing, but people wanted to have that communication. I think, to your point, looking at the upcoming off-year cycle will be interesting.
It's true, and look, and that's part of this, life in COVID, where people just don't have the same sort of personal connections. They feel restricted. They feel, some people feel a little bit caged up in their house, and that's where you get a lot of tension on these stay-at-home rules, or you get tension on closures and things, because people crave personal connection. That's just part of being a human being. There's something you get out of, and we had a lot, what a lot of our candidates did, and I would recommend this again, is doing a high quality phone calls from volunteers and from the candidate, to be doing check-ins, to be having longer conversations, to not be trying to hustle through a list, when they're calling voters on the phone, to have a more of a quality conversation, to spend a little bit more time asking people how they're doing, and make it more personal, because that's going to be more memorable to that individual, to that voter. But still, that it just still doesn't equal a face-to-face interaction.
Well, and you talk about March elections. How do you, in November election, you've got a presidential top of the ticket. People are turning out at larger percentages just naturally, specifically in such a polarized election like we just had. But you're looking at March 2021, an election. I mean, what do you see for turnout, and how? And with that in mind, how do you change your communication?
It really depends on the method of voting. So that's like we're encountering this in a special election in another state. The question is everybody going to get mailed a ballot? Because if everyone is going to get mailed a ballot, the turnout is going to be 3 or 4 or 5 times higher than if they don't. And so that's something that, is the number one thing to take into account. And then if everyone does, then we're back to what I talked about, having that election day being the day the ballots are mailed. And then you have a voting window that ends on a certain time. There's no traditional election day then. So you have to adjust all of your all the timing of your communication, of how you're reaching out to these voters, but you're also being presented an opportunity in those cases, depending on the nature of the race, to say, okay, if I have let's say it's a 2-person race, and one's an older white male and another is like a young Latina or something like that, and the composition of the district is kind of mixed. You have a real opportunity for, let's say, that younger Latina to really mobilize younger voters and Latino voters, et cetera, people who would be in her corner to mail their ballots back. And so you have an opportunity in those cases. But it just depends on how the elections are administered.
Great, Achim, thank you. We are going to go to a quick break, and we will be back right after these messages with Achim Bergmann. Win the Future is sponsored in part by Connecticut by the Numbers. Welcome back. We're here with Achim Bergmann, the partner at Bergmann Zwerdling Direct, with his partner Alex Swerdling, who's a fantastic guy as well. Achim, in terms of administering those elections, are there any states you saw do it well versus some that did it not so well?
Well, yes.
If you don't want to share that, by all means,
I think there are states that just have had more experience at managing absentee ballot processes, and that have a longer history of this, that have the rules in place about how to manage signature verification processes and things. All these things that got a lot of attention on cable news after the election. and as the votes were still being counted, because when there's the mail ballots, there's a process of verifying that signature. There's also a process of, mailing the ballots out, what sort of data is available to people to know, okay, I know that this person was mailed a ballot or whatever. And there were some states that because of the newness of this, the lack of experience, and then just the absolute volume that they were dealing with, that caused delays in places. It caused delays in mailing ballots out. When they said, "Oh, it's going to be mailed out on this date," and it actually, took a few days longer or whatever, because they just had more printing that they needed to do than they've ever dealt with before. And then it had to do with what sort of rules were in place ahead of that, and how these ballots are constructed. I mean, the ballots are, there's a lot of attention around the so-called naked ballot in Pennsylvania, for example, because they had this other envelope within the outer envelope, and if you don't put it inside the inner envelope, you only put it in the outer envelope, your ballot doesn't count. And so there are all sorts of education that goes around that. And then there's the verification process afterwards. And so it took a long time for some of these places to count, because in some states, and this also got a lot of attention, they were prohibited. Republican legislature in Pennsylvania expressly forbid ballots from being tabulated ahead of election day. And that's why that count took so long. It was less because of the actual administrators of the elect, but their hands were tied in Arizona, or some other places that do this regularly. Like, they were processing ballots as they got them. They were loading them in. They weren't reporting. Nothing was getting shown to anybody, but it was actually going in. They were verifying signatures, all that stuff. And so once the 8 o'clock hits on election night, like, boom, there's you see what everything up until like a few days before election day that had been returned was tabulated and counted. You couldn't do that in Pennsylvania or New York, for example. And that's why it just took so long to do. In New York State, actually, is where I am. They wouldn't even allow the absentee ballots to be open until a week after election day. There's still a fight happening over a congressional race not far from me here that's separated by 12 votes, and in part because they weren't allowed to start counting the ballots.
That's crazy.
And so you have this weird thing that happens on election night where the Republican, in that case, was ahead by 20 points. But that's because most of the Democrats voted by mail. And so their ballots couldn't even be counted until, the last month.
Wow. Well, speaking of crazy election nights, you were a desk for Gore in 2000, right?
My job was managing a lot of the voter contact. But yeah, I was part of that process.
So taking the feeling that night into account and juxtaposing it against kind of a crazy election night, obviously not as close of an election overall at the top of the ticket, but what similarities did you see this time around versus that time?
Well, it's just, it didn't end, and that was the first time for a lot of people's experience. I had one friend who went to sleep that night and he woke up and he said, "Who won?" And nobody. We're all on a plane going to Florida right now. So it's the fact that there wasn't any conclusion was certainly similar. There were a lot of similarities, I think, in the sort of microscope on the election process, on the process of administering elections that happened afterwards. 37 days in Florida I spent, and my job was tracking the ballot count was one of my jobs. So I knew where all the votes were, and knew where we stood when the Supreme Court issued the stay, and which was within 100 votes, by the way. Gore was at the time. But you have this sort of uncovering, and cable news is much more sophisticated now than it was 20 years ago, and they did, I think there was a really excellent job done by all the networks about how this process works, what these what is a signature verification, how these ballots differ and everything. Whereas in 2000 it was people were surprised that this was even a thing, and so there was a lot of catch up that people had to do to familiarize themselves with like how this works and why are these ballots different. Why is this one a scan ballot and these are punch cards? And no, that was what we're dealing with in 2000. And I think that there was better coverage about it, but there was also better preparation from all sides, from both sides, about what this process was going to be like. And even in states that were newer to absentee voting, both sides were well lawyered up, and they had election protection programs, and they had there was a longer process about even in advance of the election, the legal fights about what was going to count and what was not going to count and what these ballots are going to be like, et cetera. And so there was just much more of an awareness of how things were going to work afterwards, and better preparation about having teams of people ready to go. I mean, because 20 years ago, I'm being serious. Like, we were in a room in Nashville, and Nick Baldick was in charge of the campaign in Florida, and he's screaming through the speakerphone, "Don't concede!" And Gore's on his way to, just about really ready to get out of the car, actually, when he was called. And then we're figuring out what we're going to do, and we get on the Lieberman plane and we fly down there. Like, this year, the Biden campaign had people organized already in states like that. There was, they had huge teams of people who had already been briefed and prepared on what was going to happen after election day, what the observation process was going to be like, what the challenge processes would be like for these ballots in all these different places. In Florida, we just kind of had to piece it together, basically, like once we got there, and figure out how to do it.
Crazy. Well, in 06, you were with the D trip, right?
Yes.
So I think juxtaposing 06 versus 2020, where 06 there was a sweep and Democrats won overwhelmingly in both the House and the Senate. But looking at 2020, leading up to it, it seemed Democrats were extremely enthusiastic about the potential outcome. Yet it kind of fell a bit short. What do you attribute that to?
I think it fell a lot short, but I think there was a lot of optimism coming into this. It was a good election cycle for Democrats in 2018, and there was a lot of hope that it would be similar. That's a midterm. Midterm in a Republican presidency, Democrats typically pick up seats. Midterm in a Democratic presidency, Republicans typically will gain seats. That's a historical kind of precedent. Rare that things are different that way. But there was a lot of hope that 2020 would be like 2008, when Democrats built on what we did in 2006. But the difference there is you had Barack Obama running for president in an open seat, and you had a better playing field for Democrats in terms of the districts, because there were a lot of districts that we would have won in 2006 just had we had more belief that Democrats could have a good cycle, and we had better candidates recruited and better who were better funded. So those 26 or whatever seats that we won 30 seats in 2006, and 20, I can't remember the exact number, 25 or whatever it was afterwards. Probably half of those or more we would have won in 2006 had we had better candidates in those. And so we had better recruiting in 2008. The difference this cycle was, in a presidential year, normally it's a little bit muddy, and especially with an incumbent on the ballot, where things kind of are a little bit more flat down the ballot. Rare for there to be that 2008 sort of win still at the Democrats' back, and that was like also a function of the frustration after years of Bush, et cetera. And then the other thing you had this year was this Trump effect of mobilizing people, of mobilizing these really hardcore conservatives to turn out and vote. And so we had two things happen down the ballot. One is you have independent-minded voters, true independents or moderate Republicans that might be just, done with Trump. And there were a lot of them, particularly in suburbs who are better educated. And then you had, and so you had those people who they were voting for Biden, and they voted for Democrats in 2018. They voted for Democrats because they were tired of Trump. They were not Trump Republicans or Trump independents. So they voted for Democrats because that was their only way to vote against Trump. This year, they have another means to vote against Trump, and his name is Joe Biden, and he's running against Donald Trump. And so they cast that ballot, and then they go down the ballot. They mark that, and then they're okay, well, what's next? And then they start thinking, well, wait a second, I don't want, I want to get rid of Trump, but I don't want Joe Biden to have, carte blanche in Washington. And so I'm going to suck it up and vote for this Republican, even though, he's corrupt or whatever, or whatever it is that was the branding that Democrats were trying to apply to that Republican. They didn't like him. We did a race against David Schweikert in Arizona and lost by a few points. Wonderful candidate, a woman in an emergency position named Hiriel Tiperneni was running against him. This is a very Republican district, plus 14 Republicans, in terms of registration. And we lost by a few points. We would have won, though, had we had a little bit of a better district, or had there just been a different impact. Like had that race happened in 2018, she would be in Congress today. But because there was another outlet for these Republicans to say, well, I'm going to vote for Biden, but I'm going to suck it up. The negatives on this guy were overwhelming, and people didn't like him, but they were willing to eat it and vote for him because they don't want Joe Biden to do everything. They're afraid, they're nervous about whatever it is, the AOC Democrats taking over or something like that. Whatever it is that the Republicans were messaging was effective in those cases. So you had that happening down the ballot. And then you have a surge of Republicans. And I mentioned earlier, the mail ballots had a huge impact on who voted. Trump had this vote on election day thing, don't trust the mail ballots or whatever, but people were mail ballots. And so there were some precincts in California, for example, that voted well over 90% turnout in these more Republican precincts, and Democrats had this huge advantage. And so it was like a topsy-turvy sort of thing happened where Democrats had a huge advantage in the early mail ballots. Ordinarily, Republicans will mail their ballots back earlier, and Democrats are trying to catch up. In this cycle, it was totally backwards because of Trump's messaging about voting on election day, and you had these people who just ordinarily won't vote, who come out to vote for the man, and so that in the last 2 weeks of rallies and all that stuff, I think that had a real impact. And there wasn't any real dramatic change at the very end. You had these big moments in presidential campaigns. You have these big moments, the debates, right? The first debate was just totally off the rails and was really damaging to Trump. You have other moments that happened that were damaging, but in the last 10 days, things were just kind of static. Trump was out there, rolling around, doing these big, super spreader rallies, and you had these, Republicans in different states posting on all over social media all these big caravans that they were doing with their flags and everything and their guns. And so you had a lot of energy that he was ginning these people up to get out, and damn, they did, and that had a big impact down the ballot.
Interesting. So to take a little bit of a turn here, how many states? I think one thing about people who have worked in campaigns is that the kind of nomad lifestyle at one point or another is something that people have a hard time conceptualizing. But how many states have you lived in throughout your tenure in politics?
Have I lived in? Well, qualified lived.
Yeah, that's fair. How about we consider 2 months?
Probably, I'd have to say 10.
Okay.
I'm looking at the map above my desk here.
Nice.
And 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Yeah, it could be more than that, actually.
I figured that seemed pretty low. Wow. What's the craziest, what was the most interesting or crazy place that you lived out of, or bizarre, if you will?
Bizarre. I did live in Oklahoma for an election cycle,
Interesting.
and that was I grew up in California, so that was very very different culturally for me. And it was a fascinating experience, but that was probably there was they did prisoner rodeos back then still. There was still cockfighting happening, even though like just the year before it had been, outlawed by a ballot measure, but people were still doing it. So it was it was an interesting experience. There was a campaign outing to the prison rodeo. I didn't attend, but the staff had a great time at it.
Interesting. Wow. That's crazy. So you're at home. Your wife is a fitness instructor, correct? Is that? So both of you work out a lot. What's your workout routine like while you're at home?
I mean, quite frankly, I spend I try to spend about a half an hour or so in the mornings doing, and I just have a couple of free weights, and I have like some elastic bands basically to use around the house here, and we have an elliptical machine. So that's my thing. She teaches Zumba among other things, and tries to get me to do that, and it's just not something I can do.
No. Same page. No. Totally hear you. And how has virtual learning been for your kids while you've been home?
That was a struggle for them in the early, they're in school now, and the schools are open up here at the moment, and so they are in school, and they're masked all day, and they're outside as much as they can be, but it's getting cold now. But yeah, that was quite a transition, and that was happening at the same time that I'm here working from home and not in my office. And so everybody is like on a device in the house, different places, and there's all sorts of overlaps and interruptions, and they and it's back to this kind of what was missing from politics this cycle, that personal interaction, which is so important for learning. Even like kids learn as much from their peers during school as they learn from their teachers, and just being around other people. And being face to face with their teachers, and that was, I think, really challenging and very stressful. And I mean, hats off to the parents who are still managing that now. And we may be back there soon. Basically, the rule is like any positive test is going to shut down the school, and everybody's going to go virtual then. So it's almost like a matter of time. Each day we're grateful that people are being smart and safe and everything, but it's stressful for kids.
Yeah, I can't imagine. How do you feel as a parent about your kids being in school right now and with your wife being a former teacher?
It is there's some level of risk there for sure. But we're in touch with the school and the teachers every day. We got briefed on all the safety protocols, and we talk to the kids on a regular basis about how people are minding them, and they're pretty sharp and on top of whether and reporting if some kid isn't wearing their mask like they're supposed to be. So there's some anxiety there, but it's also, I think, it's a risk that you need to weigh, based on the value of their education and their experience, and like what they're gonna, how they're gonna learn. And so what they go there and they come back, and they don't really do anything else, and their grandparents live around the corner, but we're not going over there. And so it's there's just a lot of precautions that we need to take on top of what we ordinarily would, because we're taking them to school and back every day.
Got it. Well, Achim, I can't thank you enough for your time. I don't want to take up any more of it. Any final words you want to provide, or any last minute advice?
there's a lot of hope, back to politics in this election cycle that there's a real opportunity for Democrats to win the Senate in Georgia. There's a real serious opportunity that can happen. But then I think you end up no matter what, this next election cycle is going to be kind of a muddy sort of a year. You're going to end up with a lot of even if we're back and we're safe and people are vaccinated and campaigns can return closer to normal, you're going to have all these brand new districts. You've got a census process that's going to be delayed. So this is going to be a really fascinating election cycle for people who are involved in politics or watching politics to engage in and see what happens, because Democrats, we have a thin majority in the U.S. House right now. We've got we built some decent majorities in the legislature in Connecticut, but those things can change. And so there's an awful lot of work to do.
Well, Achim, thank you so much. Appreciate it. You're the best. Achim Bergmann, episode 13. And thank you for tuning in to another episode of Win the Future. Thank you for listening to the Win the Future podcast, sponsored by the strategic communications firm, A Better Campaign. Make sure to visit our website at abettercampaign.com/win the future. Please don't forget to subscribe to our podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts, and share it with your friends. Thank you for tuning in. Please tune in again next Thursday for another episode of Win the Future.